dances, I am still. Peace is my companion. Joy is my friend. The campfire, the stars, the slight breeze, the taste of the hot chocolate, and the dancing shadows are, in themselves, enough. Here I am. Why waste time wanting to be somewhere else? Join me by the campfire.
Hello, everybody. I am Aaron Simmons, and this is the inaugural episode of Campfire Philosophy. Thank you so much for joining us. If you are watching live, thank you for hopping in. And you will be able to join us for the conversation, be part of the discussion by simply dropping in questions and comments in the comment section there on YouTube or whatever format that you're watching it on. It's also being streamed to LinkedIn. I think there's some Facebook channels streaming it as well. So if you drop in comments, we'll be try to get those up into the show. We are having a little bit of technical difficulty tonight, which is expected, I guess, since the AI revolution is only halfway complete. And our guest, Christy Flanagan Fedden, has had to log off for a second. She's having some video issues, and so we are doing our best to get her back in with us. But as soon as she comes in, I will, of course, introduce her, and we will draw her into the conversation. So again, this is the first episode, Campfire Philosophy, and the idea of this podcast, videocast, is that it is not an interview with people. I figure there's plenty of other podcasts doing amazing stuff like that. I've been on them. My guests tonight have been on many other podcasts themselves. And instead of just doing an interview, the thought was, man, wouldn't it be cool to be a fly on the wall with really smart people doing really amazing stuff about really important questions? And that's what this is all about. So I am joined tonight at the campfire by three people. And Christy has been able to make it work. Fantastic.
I heard.
I am
Ironically, we're talking about AI, right?
AI has cut in our favor, it looks like. So I am joined tonight by three people who are personal friends with me, and I am honored to have them here. Kevin Shilbrack, who is a professor at Appalachian State University, and in fact wrote the essay, What Isn't Religion?, which has been instrumental in me thinking about philosophy of religion. And then Kevin Carnahan, a longtime friend of mine, who used to be a colleague of mine, actually, at Hendrix College. He's now a professor of philosophy and religion at Central Methodist University, not the University of Virginia, as the back cover of his first book claimed. Greatest typo of all time, I think. And also Dr. Christy Flanagan Fedden, who is a professor of religious studies and philosophy down at University of Central Florida, and also the director of the Interreligious Dialogue program there. So three amazing humans. They all do work at this intersection of philosophy, religious studies, theology, and then also questions of religious practice. And so thank you all for being here. In order to get things rolling, let me start by just asking you all a simple question. When was the last time you went camping? Shilbrack, what about you?
What's camping?
Yeah, too much time in the library, my man.
Too much time in the library. But to my credit, though, I was just in the middle of nowhere in Colorado, and I did a hike on a thing called the Incline, which is a vertical stairs up to what was it? I don't know, 7,000 feet or something like that. It was way up there.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing.
Yeah,
I'm impressed. What about you, Carnahan? When was the last time you went camping?
So my parents are retired, and they used to come down to the Lake of the Ozarks and park their RV. And so my family would go down there and pitch a tent next to them. But it's been a couple of years since we've done that. We were just talking about that the other day because we haven't been down to the lake. We have a pool in our backyard, and I don't see why anybody go to a lake if they have a pool. So, but yeah, it's been probably a year or two.
Oh, fantastic. And Christy, what about you? I mean, I know you're in Florida, which makes camping just kind of hot and muggy, but
well, it's treacherous. There are, lions and tigers and bears and alligators. Does for wilderness count at Disney World? In all seriousness,
it does not.
Oh, come on. It's camping. It's a campground. I think in all seriousness, there was an impromptu experience at St. George Island, one within the last 20 years that was about as disastrous as you might imagine, but that would have been actual rustic camping. And I haven't done it again. So there's my answer.
That was the last time, huh?
Yes. Well, you said Fort
Okay.
Wilderness doesn't count, and I object to your terms. But...
Well, the reason it does not count is because when I was, probably 12, maybe, I think that's about right, maybe 12, 13, my family went camping at Fort Wilderness with like this big church group. And so there were all these different families, and so we're all out there at Fort Wilderness. And it was absolutely a monsoon that rolled in that afternoon. And so I'm the oldest of 4 kids. All of us ended up in our minivan all night long with the rain just absolutely, coming down all night long, thunder clapping. It was awful. And so my experience of Fort Wilderness was so bad when I was a kid that now my view is it just has been erased from the camping lore. So, yeah.
Well, see, that isn't fair.
Yeah.
That you're changing the definition before it even begins. So,
well, as philosophers are apt to do, right? You stipulate a definition that cuts in your favor. I see. Well, it is so good to have you all with me. The topic tonight, the question tonight is, so what even is philosophy of religion anyway? And the reason I wanted to start this podcast with that question is because it's actually a question that I, as a supposedly professional philosopher of religion, have spent about 20 years trying to figure out myself. And what's really cool, and for people watching who may not know, this is what's understood as meta philosophy, right? Which is where we're asking questions about what we do in particular philosophical spaces. And so this question, what is it we do when we do philosophy of religion, is an important question because it hits on an intersection of a bunch of different concepts, terms, categories: philosophy, theology, religious studies, and then something called religion, which ostensibly is what philosophy of religion, theology, and religious studies are all interested in. And so I want to try for us to at least put forth our view of how philosophy of religion functions, both in relation to something like religious studies and theology as other academic discourses, but then also how do we then make sense of what we mean by religion in order to be philosophically aware and intentional in our discussion of it, right? And this is something that Schilbrack has certainly talked about in his work, in so many other fields of philosophy: philosophy of science, philosophy of mind, philosophy of technology. The first question is in all the textbooks. So what then is science? What do we mean by technology? What then is mind? Every philosophy of religion textbook starts with traditional arguments for the existence of theistic God, right? Problems of evil. Like, it jumps in as if the religion question was already settled and obvious. And that's fundamentally a assumption, kind of like Fort Wilderness not counting as camping, that might get us off on the wrong foot. So maybe let's start. Schilbrack, if you don't mind, give us an account of what you mean by philosophy of religion, because you are both trained in philosophy, but yet I think kind of have your disciplinary home in something called religious studies. So how is it that you would navigate that intersection? How do you make sense of it?
Well, you're right to start off by saying how contested all these issues are. One of the basic divisions is between the Professional Society of Philosophers, the APA, and the Professional Society of Religious Studies people, the AAR. Philosophy of religion can be found on both sides of that fence, and the two sides will understand each other, but they're not really doing the same thing. So I appreciate the way you introduced me, because I am a religious studies philosopher of religion as opposed to a philosophy department philosopher of religion. Yeah, you're right. I've thought a lot about concepts and categories, and in particular religion and the value of philosophical reflection on religion. But I don't want to lecture. Should I pause right there? Do other people have a view that they say, some guiding lights of what you want to accomplish in a philosophy of religion class, or maybe for Kevin, like how you distinguish it from theology, or
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. What do you think, Carnahan?
Oh, okay. So I guess my tendency, I tend to be a pragmatist about such things and think that a lot of definitions are about kind of gatekeeping and maintenance of boundaries, kind of between different societies. I find it useful to think about genealogy in this and how we get to philosophy of religion today being what it is. So, like, what what has philosophy of religion been in the past, or what did they think they were doing with philosophy of religion in the past to get us to the place that we are? And so I think that probably modern philosophy of religion, if we think about it that way, was a construct that was separate from theology in that it was supposed to be drawing on the source of reason as opposed to revelation, right? And thus focused on like the concept of God. It was still very Western, very Christian, Islamic, monotheist, although drawing from kind of the Platonic tradition a little bit more. So it tended to start from things like perfect being theology, a concept of God, rather than from revealed claims about God that you could find in Scripture, right? Um, but it was kind of naive in that. I mean, both in that it thought that you could do a simple dichotomy between reason and revelation, and in that it didn't actually open itself up to other traditions, other cultures, and ways that they thought about similar categories in their own cultures. So I mean, that's how I start thinking about it, is kind of an ideal type that would be a modern picture of philosophy of religion. And then you'd have to move on to see what philosophy of religion does afterwards.
Makes sense. Yeah, Christy, how do you see
Right.
that playing out then? In the kind of your approach to this, of course, is both at a state university that requires thinking about this in, we might say, very non-confessional ways, but it's also
Exactly.
something anchored for you in a very particular study of the 19th century, which is where this category of philosophy of religion really kind of
Word
emerges on the
emerged.
scene.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, embedded in that simple question of what is philosophy of religion are so many different paths that you could go. And some of this also speaks to the first Kevin Schilbrack's question too, about how, philosophy and religion as their own separate disciplines approach this differently. For one, I would say that when we talk about what is philosophy of religion, and Eric, you may slightly hate me again for saying this, but you know that I am allowed to do it, that in one sense, there's a different approach in analytic philosophy of religion, where that's going to be strongly tied, to systematic theology and other kind of heritage. Whereas, continental philosophy of religion is going to be, again, embedded in a completely different set of questions, time period, figures. And I also think that, the different approaches, first Kevin, I like that. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. First Kevin. But even within religion, and I'm kind of a problematic soul where I fit in both and neither at the same time, where, I'm also, my degree is in religion. My doctorate is from the Department of Religion, but I read, as Aaron knows, almost exclusively philosophical texts and applied philosophical methodologies to reading the religious texts that we did read. So there's, in and of itself, there's also many different approaches to the study of religion and defining what that is, that therefore are also going to drive anyone who's interested in philosophy of religion further, to a more specific inquiry. So I think there's a lot of different components within there. But the other question about, how do you approach this in a state university? What's interesting is that my entire inquiry, in terms of both my training and my profession, has been guided by the state of Florida. And insofar as, I studied at Florida State in a Department of Religion, but in a track, which was ethics and philosophy, largely entrenched in 19th century and 20th century continental thought. And then I'm in a program at the Department of Philosophy that's interdisciplinary, that includes philosophy, religion and cultural studies, and humanities and cultural studies. And then within that, there's also an interfaith dialogue program that would be the closest we'd get to making any kind of understanding or kind of acknowledgement in a formal way of personal faith, but yet it's still always going to be approached, in an academic sense, which already implies a certain like distance or objectivity. But that in and of itself is another question altogether that I think Kevin II and I might have, interesting kind of war stories to talk about there too. But I'll pass the baton back to y'all for a minute.
Yeah, Shilbrack, why don't you hop in and kind of respond to what's been being put on the table? Unmute yourself though, because
we're definitely not.
Your voice is so sexy.
Yeah, I can lower it. We're definitely not getting interviewed by you. We're definitely. It's already turning into the kind of campfire conversation that I think you wanted, Aaron. But right. Christy's comment about teaching in a public school, which Kevin, the other Kevin, doesn't do, and Kevin's comment about gatekeeping. It's valuable. It's good to have this campfire, this inaugural campfire podcast or event on this topic, because the gatekeeping thing works like this. Can we define philosophy of religion in a way to keep theology out of it so that we can offer this in the public universities? And so the gatekeeping that Kevin's worried about is absolutely happens. And it was very eye-opening for me to go to Europe and to go to the state universities there, where they have faculties of theology at every university. They don't have this allergy or anxiety about having theology in a state university when they have established churches. I mean, it says Department of Theology, and so maybe the central building. But this question of, well, how did you define philosophy of religion? Is it different from theology? Or how did you define philosophy? Because philosophy of religion is being marginalized in philosophy. Like those gatekeeping questions are real questions. But I do want to define terms. And Kevin was pushing back on this, but I do want to, for the following reason. Like, I think when I said in my opening comment that philosophy of religion is philosophical reflection on religion, the traditional ways for philosophers to reflect is to ask metaphysical questions and epistemological questions and ethical and axiological questions. So what that means is there's people out there that think that so-and-so is a prophet, and that there's a certain way to treat their children and their marriages and money and sexuality, and on and on and on. These are deep culturally entrenched values, and philosophers are reflecting critically on that. That's just not true, maybe metaphysically. You don't know that epistemologically, or that's not just politically speaking, or that's not moral, or maybe it is, but like that's what it is. But critical normative reflection on cultural values is not the centerpiece of what goes on in higher education any longer. So I wanted to find philosophy of religion because I want to champion those traditional liberal arts values where we say, but is that true? Is that good? Is that fair? And those questions are not being asked. They're not part of the STEM fields. And the STEM fields are expanding throughout higher education, not only to the extent that they get so much money and they get so much prestige and so forth, but there's even people in religious studies that go, well, we got to make religious studies into a science. Like we have to get philosophy and theology out from religious studies so that we fit into the neoliberal model of what higher education is about. So that's why I define these terms, because I want to be really, really transparent with my students and with my dean. This is what I'm contributing to the university. And if you're like, oh, we don't do that anymore, we don't have critical reflection on how people live, you got to say that out loud. So the defining terms means a lot to me, for sure.
So I'm curious, Kevin, when you Kevin the first, when you do that, when you try and define philosophy in that way, I mean, there's a little bit of a tension there, because in theology, right, people would also claim to be reflecting critically on a whole set of these things, and it seems like the difference probably comes down to something like a whether the starting point is confessional or something like that,
Right.
to make the distinction,
Yeah.
right? So some people are doing it from a kind of confessional standpoint, but I'm not. This gets to part of the problem for me is that I don't know how exactly. So when people say confessional, oftentimes it goes back to the idea of, are you starting from revealed truths, or are you starting from that, right?
Yeah.
And it's kind of weird place for me as a theologian when I function in that way, because I don't have a high theory of revelation, right? I mean, like, I kind of appreciate the claims of my own tradition as the products of people who have had conversations, who have produced them over time, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't know, like I understand there's a difference between the two, right? But it's drawing that line to get it exactly what is confessional, what's not confessional, right? How do you make that distinction? It ends up being a problem that I have to deal with all the time, and in part, it is a thing that when I'm teaching philosophy of religion, right? I go back to a set of fairly traditional distinctions. I say, well, we're going to pretend like what we use here is reason as opposed to revelation. That's oversimplified, but we're going to act like that's what it is. We're going to pretend like there's an absolute difference between confessional and non-confessional, when really in most of Western philosophy of religion, that's been brought in, like a lot of those confessional claims have been brought into the philosophy of religion anyway, just without saying that they're brought in, right? So inevitably it brings that up. Yeah. Okay.
One of the things, though, you're saying, Carnahan, that I find really important about making sense of the things, Shilbrack, that you are suggesting as far as this philosophy as the hallmark or core of higher education, the kind of original task of college being critical reflection on what we take to be true, meaningful, beautiful, good, etc. It seems to me that one of the ways I often understand philosophy to do that work is, Carnahan, by trying to at least frame what we claim confessionally from what we take up as the object of our critical inquiry. Right. So Alvin Plantinga, famously, a Christian philosopher of religion, suggests that ultimately there should be no difference between the confessional approach, right, starting from our deepest held beliefs, and the sort of philosophical approach reflecting then on whether those things are true. He says we always start somewhere, so why not start from a religious, springboard as opposed to some sort of scientific or objective springboard? But that gets then at the heart of what Kevin the First was saying when he says part of the problem with the STEM priorities is not at all a suggestion that we should do less science, right? We learned during COVID, we should do more science. But the way we then narrate categories like objectivity or, what counts as obvious or what is absolute, these sorts of questions are themselves not available to the reflective dimension that science has to offer. It takes for granted the categories that something like philosophy then puts into question, right? So don't we need some sort of at least buffer or distance or distinction between what we would confessionally claim to be true from within a religious community, say, or an ethical community, and what we then do regarding those claims when we sit in, the philosophic classroom or discuss as philosophers the claims made by ourselves and others? Like, how do you see that difference between, me saying something like, the spaghetti monster is God versus, well, what are the reasons to think that God is a spaghetti monster, right? It seems like there's two different levels, but it sounded like you are okay keeping those a little bit blurry.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess my worry in part here is that if we make philosophy the critical reflection on religion, right, or on theological claims, or however we want to do it, then it seems like theology is left as the uncritical reflection on those things. And I don't want that to be the case, right? Part of part of what I push for a lot is trying to get people to be more critical about their own religious tradition internal to their tradition, right? And seeing it not as a threat, right? Critical thinking, but also including that. So I guess my tendency would be to go with kind of a paradigmatic picture of each, right? If you're responding to like Plato, or I guess as we define it here in the West, like Confucius, or like these, it would probably fall on, and if you're applying primarily logic, critical thinking, formal arguments, etc., it's going to be philosophy of religion. If you're more on the side of functioning like Augustine or Thomas Aquinas, you're probably on the theology side of things.
So, Christy, how then does that play out? Because I was saying, we got a question that came in that said, like, you're in Florida. This you were saying, I'm in Texas. It sounds like that Kevin's, hey, let's be paradigmatic and think about these things, but at a certain level, doesn't that kind of walk a line that might be dangerous relative to the way that this thing gets deployed? Like, are you teaching religion, or are you philosophically reflecting on what people do when they take themselves to be religious?
Right. I mean, my head is spinning a little bit. I saw some of the comments and then kind of reflecting on a couple of things that Kevin II said. I think that the quickest way to answer that question, just to get back to what you said, Aaron, is that it's from my perspective, I think it's really important to make that distinction between studying religion and being a religious practitioner, that those in and of itself are two completely different positions. And I see the latter as being more aligned, generally speaking, with theology, of course, as opposed to religious studies or the study of religion. And so there's a lot of kind of methodological approaches that are embedded in those two different distinctions, and also, what you're teaching, how you're teaching it, the assumptions that one might be making in teaching it, things along those lines. The question that was asked about how in the world can we do this in Florida? Yes, there's a lot to be said there. I think the answer that I will say in the most strategically minded mindset that I could have is that we recently were sat down to talk about and learn what the GEP, the strictest mandates right now are for general education classes, for GEP classes, because everybody has to take them as opposed to upper division classes. There are now by state statute standards and outcomes that, when I shouldn't say outcomes, just standards that certain GEP classes have to meet, say Intro to Philosophy, Encountering the Humanities, things of that nature. And a lot of people had a lot of questions. And when I remember sitting in this meeting about saying, one of the standards was something to the extent of, instructors will not teach identity politics, or instructors will embrace all positions in the classroom, or not expect students to take a certain position. And the first thing I said is that to even be having this conversation, to even have this standard, implies a deep and fundamental misunderstanding of what religion or philosophy is anyway. Because I don't know of any philosopher of religion, theologian, who pedagogically would teach a subject with the intention of requiring a student to take a certain normative position on any of it, whether it was Descartes or Christianity or natural law or whatever you want it. That is not our role in a classroom. And which gets back to my initial distinction between studying religion versus being a religious practitioner. The other thing that I was thinking that makes this a lot more complex relates to something that Kevin I said about this STEM-centric mentality. And I think while the connection isn't immediately clear, it does have this sort of infatuation we have with empirical verification now, right? That's part of what gets us into such a mess. In terms of, well, how can you talk about, forget about the distinction between religion and theology, how can you even talk about this in general for lack of any type of evidentiary claim? And that in and of itself, what kind of inaugurated the discipline in itself, is because there's so much that we can talk about that exceeds, the ability for empirical evidence, and not by default or not by some type of deficiency, but by design. That's the very nature of the content, that we're discussing. And, those are the kinds of questions that I think are, that most intrigue me in terms of why we need not just religious studies, but philosophy of religion to try to think about some type of framework that helps us approach those questions. Because other types of inquiry are going to fall short, not because they're inadequate, but because of the nature of the object itself of what we're studying.
Right. Well, so this brings us to, I think, two interesting questions that are kind of layered into both what Carnahan and then Christy, what you both are saying. One, I agree with you both saying that if we are to differentiate philosophy of religion or philosophy more broadly and something called theology, it's probably going to be in a kind of broadly Thomistic sense where one philosophy is available to, you might say, reason giving among all, members of the philosophical community, whereas theology is something deployed relative to a particular kind of confessional set of commitments that are operative within a community defined by something like a religious framework, right? So we might say, broadly speaking, theology has some degree of a confessional requirement. Philosophy not only doesn't have that, but in fact might reject it, might actually think that's a problem. So if that's the case, and then Shilbrack, I want you to take a swing at this. If that's a loose way of making sense of philosophy versus theology, isn't it the case that theology then seems like it might be a problem as a discourse taught at the university level in light of the critical thinking work that you were saying should be so central, right? I know a lot of the people that we all read, the Russell McCutcheons and Craig Martins and Jonathan Z. Smiths and others have suggested this, right? That the deeper we get such that philosophy of religion looks, or religious studies looks like theology, we're now doing something else, and it's something not viable within a university setting. How would you see that, Kevin? I actually disagree with them on this point, but I'm interested, since you also engage these questions quite regularly, how would you take up, should theology be a discourse at the university level?
I totally disagree with them as well. And I think I'm agreeing with Carnahan on this, that you can have a distinction among religious practitioners who say, I want to critically reflect on my faith, but I won't ask about certain things. It's just going to be doctrinal for me, or it's confessional for me, or it's not something that we could call into question. It would be identity politics in some sense. So if that's confessional theology, then there's I think what Kevin's talking about is, I like the label academic theology, and I think there's no way to successfully exclude it. I think if you say, well, these people, they assume that the largest framework of reality has this theistic perspective, and we got to exclude that. We can't critically reflect on that. That would be academic theology. If you excluded that, are there frameworks that are there some disciplines in the academy or some inquiries in the academy that don't have any frameworks like that? I think there's a physicalist in our chat talking, and I would love to include them too. I would assume that they would say, yeah, I stand in a particular place. I see the world from my perspective. I'd like to critically reflect on how I was formed this way and what the implications are as much as I can. I don't see how that's different from Christians or how that's different from Buddhists and how that's different from Muslims and so on. So I guess I was hinting at this, but I didn't say it explicitly before. I think that in Europe, they have academic theology, as opposed to just seminaries or training in the faith or something like that. And I don't see a way to exclude that. Just to give a really fast anecdote, one time I was on a stage with Bruce Lincoln, who's a famous Marxist. I think maybe the people in the room here know, but maybe not everybody in the audience knows. Famous Marxist comparativist, a brilliant guy. And he was trying to say, as Aaron just did, we got to keep theology out of the university. It doesn't belong in the university. And I said, yeah, but how do you draw that line in such a way that you don't kick ethics out of the university? Because that's going to be normative, critical judgments about people's lives. He said, I'm not kicking anybody out. And I think there's a lack of clarity about what the implications are of defining higher education in such a way that it doesn't include normative evaluation. So normative evaluation for me is the umbrella that includes philosophy of religion and academic theology and ethics and maybe, you know, political theory and feminism too. And I think you're going to find it all over the place in the university, and it belongs there. Otherwise, all you get is vocational training. Like higher education is just professional and not self-reflective or critical.
Yeah, no, and let me make clear, and Kevin, of course, knows this, but my own view on this is not that we should kick theology out of the academy. It's actually there is no non-perspectival position from which one could begin to ask a question. So reflection is always itself already enmeshed in a fabric and framework of assumptions. And if we don't take seriously those assumptions as already operative, we're acting like we're doing critical inquiry when in fact what we're doing is allowing that critical inquiry to have like a floor below which we will not continue to push. So that doesn't mean, and this is an important point to those who, there was a comment that came in and said, we've got to be careful though about not like, you know, forcing people to, you know, abide by or assent to certain perspectives. That seems right. And I think all of us would say there's a big difference, though it's still maybe complicated. There's a big difference between, hey, come join my how to pray class, right? Versus come join my philosophy of religion class. Or even let's think about scholastic theology or a seminar on Aquinas or Duns Scotus or Maimonides. Very different than here's how you engage in praise and worship, right? So how to be religious is in no way the kind of thing that even academic theologians are doing. It's more, what is it we should take seriously as meaningful in the spaces where we find ourselves? And so this actually, I think, Shilbrack, you're right to say the worry is that this runs us into problematic policing of the discursive engagement, right? And so you're right. How do we then say ethics counts? This is the problem I've always had, though I admit I'm becoming more sympathetic to it in light of contemporary political realities. There will be a later episode of Campfire Philosophy called Why Democracy Needs Disagreement. And so we're going to take up this question with some political theorists. But John Rawls famously says, anything that's a comprehensive doctrine, whether that be religious perspective or moral commitments or even ostensibly aesthetic views that ground your sense of the world, are fundamentally off the table for political engagement because it doesn't allow for public reason to be deployed. And the worry, of course, as many have raised against Rawls, is but your account of public reason is already someone's account of the public, right? You can't ever get out of yourself to give an account of where you find yourself. It's always from within. And in many ways, this is where, Anna, thanks so much for reminding us about the kind of, physics intersection with philosophy. I started as a physics major and then moved into history and then into philosophy. It's important to say we can affirm something called objectivity and then still recognize that that is a particular discursive practice within a historically contingent debate about what then gets to count as objective, right? There were times in history, I mean, Kevin, you could speak to this, I'm sure, given your recent work on Israel-Palestine, where all kinds of moral or religious views were considered objectively the case, even in the context of political life. We now find ourselves in the US having those battles. We call it, culture wars, right? But it's effectively who then gets to decide what will be taken for granted rather than available for contestation. And that discourse of very little is obvious, the questions can continue, is part of, I think, what threatens, Christie, the legislature of Florida, and the politicians in Texas, et cetera, right? Is if we start letting questions be available in this or that space, we are undermining the obviousness of what we've told people was objective. And that's, of course, a really bizarre way of making sense of objectivity in the first place, which is what philosophy, I think, does a pretty good job of helping us think through, right? Kevin, how do you see this, or Carnahan, how do you see this playing out at the level, because you do public social ethics, right? So do you see the analogy that Schilbrack's offering, that I'm echoing, that what we're doing in the university space when we do something called philosophy of religion, as opposed to something like religious practice, in a synagogue or a mosque, is that actually something that is helpful for making sense of the way our political discourse works regarding these very same issues?
I would say that if you go beyond the academy, people just don't have any understanding of any of this. Mostly when you talk about philosophy of religion in public, what people are going to hear is something like apologetics. Because what they identify it with is, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the moral argument. And that's what they immediately go to. And usually the versions of those that they're familiar with are really not the best versions of those either. They're things that they've heard some evangelist giving them, or some kind of neo-atheist denying, kind of dismissively. And I guess this brings us back to where I think we've gotten. So I said, I think the modern idea of philosophy of religion was supposed to be this kind of from reason as opposed to revelation, not from community. And I think where we've come is a place where, actually all of these represent different kinds of communities and have different standards that are applied in them. There are boundaries. So I teach philosophy of religion and I teach theology classes, and both of them have boundaries for the discussion that we just can't go past, right? If somebody starts to do an argument about the existence of the soul in my thing, and start in my philosophy class and starts quoting the Bible, I'm like, nope, that's not allowed in here, right? Whereas in my theology class, there's all sorts of other things that I have to say, oh, nope, we're not going to go there. And it's not because either of these is just simply confessional or not confessional or something like that. They're just standards for what counts as participation in the dialogue. And I guess that's one of the things that I've noticed, that I've realized teaching philosophy of religion, is how many of the students' initial responses to things are things that are just not included in the tradition of philosophy of religion. And so sometimes students will come up with these really creative things that they want to respond to questions with. And I just have to say, that is really interesting, but that is not in the line that was engaged by Locke or Plato or Hume or Kant. And so I don't think we can actually go down that road, right? Because we're actually in a tradition here. And in order to get you to the tradition that we're talking about and make sure that you've hit all the bases in that you've got the knowledge that you need, right? We need to engage those things. And then this, I suppose, opens up the second question of philosophy and religion today. So if we recognize that this is a kind of community, the other thing is that philosophy of religion, if it's going to be philosophy of religion, needs to be something more than philosophy of Western monotheistic, Neoplatonic religion, which is another question of how you're going to, whether it should be broadened out and how it could be broadened out. That takes it beyond. Yeah.
Well, that point there is a wonderful point to come back to. We're going to take a quick break, say thanks to a couple sponsors, and we come back. Christy, I'm going to flip it to you because I want to hear about how the interfaith dialogue introduces this, what has traditionally been understood as a comparative engagement but of course it may or may not be something that's being compared, but appreciated in a cross-cultural, multicultural sort of way. And then I also want to hear Shilbrack about the great book series that you edit at Bloomsbury, and I might co-edit it with him, it turns out. But I'd love to hear about the way that we're approaching doing that book series, because I think that also speaks to Kevin's point about needing to not think philosophy of religion is really just philosophy of classical Western monotheism. So let's take a quick break and we'll be right back.
I hope you are enjoying Campfire Philosophy. I would like to take a moment to thank Siip for sponsoring the show. Daniel Sanderson is the guy behind that media outlet, and he is a fellow lover of philosophy. So if you get a chance, head over to planksip.org. That's PLANKSIP.org. If you sign up for their ideal plan and use the offer code AARON, that's AARON, you will get 50% off for the first 6 months. Free book publishing and lots more. Go check them out. And thanks so much to Daniel and Siip for sponsoring Campfire Philosophy. Now, back to the show.
So again, thank you, Siip. Thank you, Daniel Sanderson, for all your support and encouragement to get this going. Please do go over to planksip.org and get involved with what they've got happening. Free book publishing, amazing stuff. If you are a philosopher, wants a broader audience, they are the people to help you do it. So let's dive back in. Christy, maybe what even is something called comparative philosophy of religion? And how then might we try to overcome this sense that philosophy of religion has narrowed what religion can mean to a very particular kind of monotheistic, even maybe specifically Christian conception? How do we bridge that and build that out?
Right. And you had also asked me about interfaith dialogue, so I'll start there and then back up, because the way, there's so much of what I learned about studying religion, the distinction between, studying religion and religious practice, learning about religious. I know there was a question in the chat that implied that in order for one to be, an expert in within a certain tradition, that you're actually a practitioner itself, and having been trained by someone, having, for example, learning about Islam in graduate school for someone who's an ordained Presbyterian minister, that kind of, blows that distinction out of the water. And so I've spent my whole academic career up until this point of getting involved with interfaith dialogue and really kind of learning how to separate and bracket, make various distinctions about personal practice versus what we study and what we're doing when we're doing, religious studies and philosophy of religion. And so then about 5 years ago, a colleague at UCF talked to me about how he had had this interfaith dialogue program at another institution. And so I learned about it. It was very fascinating. And it stems from an organization that's called Interfaith America. And they're a great organization. They're based out of Chicago. They do a lot of different work. Some of their work is academic. Some of it is focused towards student life. But the one thing that I had to learn when I went to this institute and learned about it and then thought about what the program would look like is that now, rather than, what Rory might want us to do to check these faiths at the door, that I had done like a very noble little soldier, that is no longer the case. We're assuming at the outset that religious practice is now something that needs to be incorporated into this approach. So much where I actually had, to make some type of identification about what my religious faith is, which in and of itself is a long and complicated conversation. But that was only when I was training to do it. So the program that we do at UCF it's a certificate program. It's a smaller program, like a kind of a mini minor, like 12 credit hours, and we teach a class. But what that class assumes is that whatever kind of whatever career path you're going to take, you're going to encounter people of different religious traditions. So it's the one class that I've ever encountered in academia anywhere that acknowledges that religious positions are what people are trying to understand. And then you have to incorporate, well, what does that mean when you're teaching a class? What does that mean when you're training to be a nurse? What does that mean when you're studying international marketing and you have to understand, different mores in terms of whatever your message might be, things of that nature. So it definitely was a very eye-opening experience about how to incorporate some of these different positions. But I also think it's important for the conversation they've been having to back up a few notches when we're talking about, Aaron, you mentioned Rawls. I really somewhere wanted to talk about how does the role of public reason and some of the conversations that we've inherited, say from Rorty, Stout, Woltersdorf, et cetera, how, and I also think this relates to Kevin, the first initial conversation about, what we're trying to do in the academy, that I think with faith, and I mean that in as ironically as I possibly can, I think there's a good faith effort that there's a way where we can navigate some of these distinctions and understanding, we're less concerned about the discussion between theology versus religious studies, because we assume as a matter of faith that we as professionals can also make appeals to public reason that help us to understand how that, is relevant to other pursuits. I think part of what makes people nervous, whether we're talking about state regulations or when we're just having general conversations where, Kevin II mentioned, people simply don't understand what it is that we do. I think it's, again, that assumption that doesn't look at whatever public reason might be, however that's navigated, however that is discursively defined, that we're starting from some type of position of confession or some type of position of faith. And that's the one thing that I think is very difficult for people to understand, that that's simply off the table. And there are times when some of these conversations about how we can have theology as part of this, I'll be completely honest, and I think I'm in the minority here, I am somewhat nervous by that conversation, because I do think it's a really hard road to find, maybe particularly because having been trained to teach religious studies in Florida for all of this time, I've had I can count on 0 fingers the amount of time, and I'm about to jinx myself, how that's posed any issues because of falling in these kind of strict kind of pedagogical and methodological approaches. And so there's a way in which taking any type of theological position makes me very nervous. That doesn't mean, and I think it's more not what the theologian would take, what the academic theologian would take. I think it's more being so hardwired to not have any type of expectation of the student, not to have any type of theological that the student is any type of position or occupies any type of faith claim whatsoever, it may come up, it may very likely come up in a conversation, but by no means is it expected anywhere in the course of the conversation, even if you, as you were saying, Kevin, that there are certain times where, the appeal to this text or this reasoning is or is not appropriate. Because again, that's still, a pedagogical approach that's confined to the class. But there's something different. There's a residue that's different about how theology fits that like I said, I'll be honest, it does make me uncomfortable. But the why and the whither and how to define that, I think is a much harder, because there's a nuance there that I know that we're all in agreement with. But how you would explain that elsewhere and what criteria you would define, I think would be difficult to do so.
Yeah, and in many ways, what you're hitting on is what the philosopher Nick Woltersdorf refers to as public philosophical reason.
Right.
And he says, look, Alvin Plantinga and he and some others just think there is no such thing as public philosophical reason. People like myself absolutely think there is public philosophical reason, even if it is never actually an objective thing, but historically defined in terms of the kind of, categories that we are allowing to gain traction or not, given the community of scholars, the community of peers. And I'm okay with that rigidity within a slippery context, rather than it having to be a kind of absolute. And I think it's right though, right? I mean, the idea that we can say X is going to be the case for us is recognizing and acknowledging the fact that we could have said Y, right? As opposed to saying X is the case and therefore let's make sense of us, right? That we are the ones in complicated ways deciding what will and won't count. And the we here is itself a contested category. Is it we scholars, we academics, we pastors or practitioners, we citizens, we legislatures, right? So Schilbrack, you have, I think, been at the forefront in philosophy of religion, calling for the overcoming of what you call the three kind of traditional dogmas or ideologies of philosophy of religion. And you say that philosophy of religion has traditionally been too cognitivist in the sense that it's focusing on belief rather than practice. It's been too narrow, focusing on Christianity and theism over, broader quote unquote religious or cultural traditions. And it's also been too insular, where philosophers tend to talk only to other philosophers rather than to sociologists and anthropologists and cognitive scientists and historians. So how is it that you see a future for philosophy of religion that overcomes some of that narrowness and in a way that invites the kind of interfaith dialogue that Christie is promoting at her institution? How do we do that? What does that look like?
Can I tell a quick joke first? So when I published that criticism of philosophy of religion as insular and cognitivist and narrow, there's this big audience, and a fellow who's pretty well-known analytic philosopher of religion stood up and he said, well, that's just not fair and it's not accurate. He said, I can very quickly prove that philosophers of religion do talk to other people in religious studies. And I said, okay, go ahead. And he said, well, philosophy of religion is in religious studies and we talk to ourselves. I said, I thought you were going to contradict me, man. I think you're proving the point.
That's fantastic.
I did have that critique, and I'm not the only one. There's quite all four of us, I think, share those sensibilities. But it's remarkable. I think we live in an amazing time for philosophy of religion understood as a global enterprise now. There are so many centers and so many projects, and I find it eye-opening that Christie's talking about an interfaith, Interfaith America supported certificate that you can get at the University of Central Florida. I never would have guessed that. But the truth is that philosophers of religion are spilling over those boundaries that I was talking about. They are more embodied. They are more practice-centered. They are not exclusively Christian. They are in dialogue with other religious traditions and interested in other religious traditions around the world. So that's happening. But this is a couple generations after the non-philosophers were doing this. I think in the streets, in the what we would call it, modern North Atlantic cultures, unbelievably fascinated by mindfulness, by meditation, by possibilities of reincarnation and karma. Like people are, I use that phrase, critical reflection. People are critically reflecting on religious beliefs and practices every day outside of the university. And the question is whether academic philosophy and academic theology, for that matter, help them do it better, or just keep focused on this traditional narrow insular version of itself. I find that the discipline's expanding, but it's way behind the public. People are, it's not like I'm introducing my students to Buddhism. They've thought about Buddhism their whole lives. They've thought about indigenous people's religions their whole lives. They're interested in Yoruba stuff. They're interested in Japanese pilgrimage, all kinds of things as part of a path that's going to be leading them to a flourishing existence of some kind. So I'm just glad to see the field catch up.
Yeah, and this is, I mentioned it earlier, Kevin Shilbrack and I actually edit a series at Bloomsbury called Expanding Philosophy of Religion. And the whole idea is, to encourage scholars to think about philosophy of religion as pushing beyond narrow boundaries of philosophical discourse understood as, restrictive rather than, experimental, and also pushing beyond a very particular notion of philosophy of religion as just a Christian or monotheistic, set of concerns, right? And so it's been really fascinating seeing the kinds of texts that have come in. We've got, books that have been submitted about how do we overcome a belief bias in religious discourse. We've had texts come in about global critical philosophy of religion, which is where we engage philosophy of religion from a perspective that starts by saying, how do we think critically about the categories on offer internal to the questions that we're asking? And then we've also had some come in that were, very specific to what would a, Hegelian Hinduism look like when it takes up the problem of evil. And it's so exciting because as we've had these books come in and working with these different authors, it has certainly helped me as somebody trained in fairly traditional philosophy of religion. My class, when I teach philosophy of religion, is now radically different than it was 10 years ago, because it is drawing on different cultural traditions that have historically been termed religious. And it starts with the first month of class simply asking, what do we talk about when we talk about religion? Mm-hmm. And these are just not questions philosophers take up enough. Mm-hmm. And yet, I think that there's reasons they don't. And for me, those reasons, I want to hear, Carnahan, what you think about this. I think the reasons we tend not to, we philosophers of religion, is because A, within the broader political context of, American higher education, there's just no requirement that we do, right? It's easy to kind of fall back into a latent, monotheistic framework without being challenged by that, either by students, by parents, by colleagues, by legislatures, etc. So it's easy to stay there, to remain complacent. But then secondly, one of the things that terrifies me is it's just freaking daunting to even get a handle on the debates in very narrow, specific, specialist ways. Mm-hmm. And now you want me to talk about, sweat lodges and Yoruba tribes and African religious traditions. And I'm just going to do this badly. So rather than suck at it and be dismissive or problematic to these traditions, I just will respect them by not, letting my ignorance show. So what do you think, Carnahan? How can we overcome some of that?
Well, I mean, one of the things that you need are just really good textbooks that start to do this. I think you're starting to see them out there. We have really good textbooks, introductions that do excellent jobs, right, on breaking down the traditional Western categories of philosophy of religion. I don't think that we have as many and as good textbooks that you can start at and kind of get a handle on even what this new kind of philosophy of religion would look like, right? What does it look like to move? On the one hand, if we're going to overcome all three of these kind of narrow ways of thinking, right? It would be easy enough or it'd be hard enough to try and overcome one of them. If we kept the cognitive bias but extended it to other cultures, then we could just take up a whole bunch of arguments in other, traditions. But when we're going to add to that? Oh no, we also want to take into account religious practice. Well, I mean, I do think that there is a kind of drinking from a fire hose problem that you run into, or a lot of younger faculty who are not trained in this stuff from the beginning are going to feel like that's just too much for me right now, right? So in some ways, you've got to build this throughout the institutions and get it all the way back to where you're actually training people in this. You've got textbooks, you've got the whole structure there that allows people to do this. I mean, as somebody who teaches something like world religions, right? Another class that I don't think anybody's qualified to teach in some way. Because you're going to be going up there and talking about things and reaching the limits of your knowledge. There's no way that you can avoid doing that. And in some ways, this pushes philosophy of religion in a similar direction.
So two things. One, I'm putting up a QR code for a book that was recently released in our series that actually, there it is, that actually does the work that Carnahan is suggesting we do. It's Tim Knepper, a good friend of all of us, Global Critical Philosophies of Religion, just came out in our series, highly recommended for anybody who wants to kind of dig deeper into these ways of doing things a little bit more inclusively. Also, for any professors of philosophy of religion watching, if you want a resource to do this in your own classes, there's really none better than this, I think, as a on-ramp to rethinking how we do stuff. Christy, what are the resources that you use in the Interfaith Dialogue program to stimulate conversation and questions in ways that really do foster understanding or respect, empathy, hospitality, not just a kind of comparative assessment? How do you find resources that do that?
Right. I mean, that's a great question, because when we designed that class, we had a lot of conversations about what it would look like. And initially, my initial thought about what that class would look like was more along these lines, that it would veer more in towards like kind of a methodology class. We're going to talk about these really big issues of religious identity and subjectivity, and kind of do everything that world religions can't, for all the reasons that Carnahan just said. And but in the end, it's a very different kind of class. And I think also to answer what Schilbrack was asking is like, how can, he was interested in how a class like that fits at UCF. And one of the reasons why it does is this emphasis on the experiential learning component, and the fact that interfaith dialogue, by its very definition, that class has appeals to people that are actually not necessarily students of religion or philosophy. Like, there's a huge kind of draw, or who we're trying to recruit are nursing majors. It was approved to be an elective in the School of Nursing, and to the School of Social Work, things, because we're trying necessarily to have, for people that there would be a small, I think the prerequisite is world religions, but we really want to not get into these really deep questions, because by necessity, we're looking at what it means to have kind of a public religion and a practical religion, and how this plays out. It ties to other areas. So what that class looks like is, and what we read is a real kind of hodgepodge of different texts. I mean, we do read Eboo Patel, and if you're not familiar with Eboo Patel, he's the founder of Interfaith America, and there's a kind of significant approach, I think, to kind of empathy and storytelling to understand how this model of religion, the paradigm we have of a melting pot as religious identity in the United States is somewhat antiquated, because of the idea that there's no multiplicity, there's no real pluralism in such a model, that because we lose, the kind of specificity of the identity, as opposed to this potluck dinner where we can still look at everyone's different identity, where they find themselves. But I think it really relies on a lot of case studies to look at what are some of these problems in a real context. What happened when there was this? What happens when a medical practitioner has to treat someone who refuses a blood transfusion? What happens when there's a conflict with a religious symbol in a public space? Who gets to decide that? What are the sources that we use? What are different definitions of, hate crime and, religious persecution, or some other type of prejudice? And I think that the real takeaway that we get from this is to emphasize that through these cases and through this telling of stories, that it really helps. I think it helps to humanize a lot of this. And my colleague called it kind of like a love-in type of class, because it really is a very different it's a very different academic approach, because it's trying to be inclusive of all these different perspectives, many of whom are not going to be majors in philosophy of religion. So a lot of my really idealistic hopes that we're going to have these really kind of fundamental discussions about religion as sui generis and religious identity, that was kind of put by the wayside. And I'm taking over it in the spring, so we'll see what I do with it. But I think that emphasis on the practicality and the implementation and what this looks like for someone who's training to be a public school teacher or a nurse, I think is a really important part of it. And it's somewhat related, though, it's definitely an offshoot to what we've been talking about, but it's related because it helps us understand to an extent what that link between theory and practice is, because so much of what I think we're nervous about here is where the religious practice fits in. Because I, again, being of this kind of, nervous position, I suppose, I often have seen religious practice as something entirely different. And what we're doing in philosophy of religion are all these different methodologies to help kind of lay bare, identity issues, moral issues, social issues. And the difference is that this is where religious practice is fair, and it's fair for conversation, because it's, again, we're looking at what it looks like in this context by someone being trained to approach it in a different, whatever their paths may be. Yeah. So I think that that's what links the two of them together.
And what's the actual name of that class? Like, what is it students sign up for?
Interfaith dialogue.
Interfaith dialogue. Okay.
And
interesting.
Chrissy, if I could ask a question, so the setup of like religion and philosophy at your school, is this happening in one silo or the other, or across, or how does that work?
So we have 3 separate programs of study in which a student could major or minor, and so that includes philosophy. It's interestingly in my department, it's called Religion and Cultural Studies. I think there aren't a lot of programs that are called that. And then we also have Humanities and Cultural Studies. There's a fair amount, particularly between religion and philosophy, and humanities and religion. I would say there's a fair amount of interdisciplinarity that exists, particularly in, say, theories and methods requirements that our majors have to take. And with me, just because I do teach so much in both philosophy and religion, I'm the program director of Religion and Cultural Studies. So I also, work with the curriculum and the student advising and things of that nature, but I teach a great deal in philosophy. And there are actually a number of my colleagues in religion who also teach a fair amount in philosophy. Again, overlapping with so many of the things that we just talked about. So I think that there's a fair amount of interdisciplinarity within the 3 programs, even though they are distinct majors for the students.
I think that sounds really helpful and really healthy in the way that you've got that set up, because I can imagine other, contexts in which there would be, like we've been talking about, boundary wars or, fights between different departments about where something fits and whether we should have it or you should have it. I can imagine that being a problem in a different context.
Oh, we're just fighting with ourselves. So it stays close to home.
So you are doing all of the non-narrow stuff that Schilbrack described, right? As long as you talk to each other.
Well, we're talking to ourselves and each other, and sometimes ourselves when we're supposed to be talking to each other. We're doing all of those things. Yes.
My grandpa once said that he always would talk to himself just because the only way he could guarantee a great conversation. So I don't know if that's like deeply Socratic or egoist.
Well, that's the claim. An Irishman, in order to find his equal, must talk to God. That's why I went into theology. So,
Well, Darlene has offered a few comments that I think really speak to what we're hitting on, which is one of the reasons that lots of universities now are really suggesting the importance of things like study away, internships, having experiences that give you quote unquote real world, traction. Part of what all of that's about, at least I think, and this goes back to Schilbrack's point of what's the university for, it's because it lets you try on different modes of understanding yourself in a space where your understandings are not taken for granted, right? So when I studied abroad, when I was in college, it was the first time in a really extended way I was able to recognize that my assumptions, my, things I considered obvious, the stuff that I took for granted, just wasn't by other people in other spaces. And it forced me to recognize the real existential power of contingency. And so the same is true with studying languages, right? The fact that, well, that's just what it means is a really problematic hermeneutic when applied to all texts, but especially those claimed sacred by religious traditions, right? And so being able to understand, language ability, studying away, different internships, letting you try on different modes in which your life could play out so that you realize none of it's necessary. It could be otherwise. I think that this is part of what studying religion, whether as a philosopher or a historian or a sociologist or an anthropologist, all of these different approaches allow us, as Darlene says, to understand that there's something happening when we deploy this term in broad, culturally significant ways, even if problematic. And as the scholar Tomoko Mazazawa, rightly says, the category of world religions is also an invention of the 19th century. It's exported based in a very particular westernized monotheistic frame. Like, all of this can be true, and yet there's something important about recognizing what religion means for me may not be what it means for others. And I see this as a deeply democratically important lesson, right? I remember, in fact, when I was in, I guess it was in grad school, I went to St. Olaf up in Minnesota to study Danish, studying Soren Kierkegaard. And while I was there, I went to a local church. It was part of my denomination. But it turns out my denomination in Minnesota looked very different than my denomination in Eastern Tennessee. And that was fascinating to me, because the categories that I was working with were ruptured just by regional distinctions that I couldn't appreciate without allowing myself to be, as Martin Heidegger would say, put in question by the texts, rather than just always thinking my questions are the right ones, right? So, Shilbrack, how is it that you foster for students, or even when you give public talks, how do you foster that receptivity to being put in question? Because at least for me, I find myself, whenever I enter social media spaces and say, it seems like that y'all are operating with a rather problematic approach to biblical interpretation here. I'm not saying I've got it figured out, but there's different views. And I get called a heretic. Recently was told, that hell was waiting for me. Like, the ability just to even try to let the questions be questions is seen as so dangerous. I'm interested in how you found some traction in helping people be able to move into those spaces.
Wow. That's a good question for all four of us, because I think our contexts are really different. So you and Carnahan are in these private schools, and Christy and I are in these public schools. I'm in the Bible Belt, and I've taught at a Christian liberal arts college in the past, but my experience is nothing like that. I'm not saying you're not going to hell, but my goodness, my students are so, what's the word, post-Christian or post-theistic, that they've got tensions with their parents and with the Republican Party, which I think has hijacked this faith. And I taught the last time I taught philosophy of religion, and it's coming around again, so I have to figure out what to do. They had zero interest in arguments for or against the existence of God. They just thought it would be a waste of time. They had no apologetic or anti-apologetic agenda. And so the question for them was really that the text that they liked the most was what kinds of spiritual practices did Stoics do? And then, because they were like, but I can use that. And this thing about, well, what caused the Big Bang? I can't use that for shit. Right. So that's not helping me live my life. But this other thing about keeping a journal, about planning ahead for the activities I'm going to be engaged in and whether they could go sideways. Like, I can do those things, and I'm going to have a better day. My mood's going to be better. My emotions, my relationships, they're all going to be stronger. So that, like, what would we call that? Spirituality? They were more interested in spirituality than they were in traditional philosophy of religion. And so I take seriously the question before about, you can't do every tradition in the world, and you certainly can't do every intellectual tradition in the world plus all their practices. But my students wanted to go straight to the practices.
That's fascinating. And what do you think, Shilbrack? I want to stay with this because you've been doing some really cool stuff in what's called embodied cognition. And so, do you think that the kind of sociological or psychological approaches to the study of religion are offering a way forward here? And this question is coming in from John Sanders, a friend of many of us on tonight.
I saw that question come up.
Do you see that as maybe a resource here that we can draw from cognitive science in various ways, draw from sociological approaches, so that students maybe think that they're getting a STEM discipline, even though we're doing this in philosophical ways? Do you see that as a resource?
I definitely think that philosophy of religion or an embodied philosophy, practice-centered approaches to religion, this cluster of questions that have to do with the body and embodiment, those are distinct. It's going to be interdisciplinary, and you're going to have to lean on other fields. I don't know that it's psychology, and I don't know that it's sociology, though. That they can be awfully positivistic over there in the social sciences, but there's revolution going on, I think, in cognitive science, and what did they call them? Neuroscientists, I guess. Like, there's a overlap, I think, between this branch of philosophy and cognitive sciences and neurosciences, which obviously is absolutely relevant to psychology, to evolutionary psychology, to sociology that's focused on practice. I think it's completely healthy for the field. But everybody's behind, if that makes sense. Like, I think all the traditional disciplines are trying to reinvent themselves and come to terms with a post-Cartesian understanding that you're not a brain in a vat, you're not just a thinking thing, but you've been shaped in all kinds of habitual and embodied and social ways that you're not conscious of, but it's shaping how you think and how you live and how you love.
Yeah, well, and in fact, as a plug, again, a friend of all of ours and part of these conversations, John Sanders actually recently published a book called Theology in the Flesh, which I highly recommend, which is modeling what it could look like to draw on cognitive science and in particular cognitive linguistics to rethink the way that we talk about both religion, God, faith, these categories that tend to show up. So highly recommend Theology in the Flesh by John Sanders. So I think we're getting to a point where, as we're kind of, the campfire needs some new logs, or it's time to hit the tents, right? Like, I want to ask you all the same question, and then we're going to close out actually by having a little bit of fun and doing a speed round of camping questions. So the last question I do want to ask, though, which is I think where Shilbrack is kind of landing us, is, so when we talk about philosophy of religion, we've discussed why it might be different than theology because of confessional loyalties. It seems to be something that is definitely distinctive from the actual investment and practice of, just doing religion in some sort of cultural community. We've discussed the ways that teaching it can be more productive if we are engaged with other traditions. And we've also discussed some of the challenges because of the assumptions and political realities that accompany the work we do as scholars in a particular cultural space, right? So we've covered a lot of ground. But if you could, be appointed, whatever, the grand poobah of philosophy of religion, and you also happen to hold the, chair of, whatever, Secretary of Education, what is it that you think would be the most important way of making philosophy of religion more prominently available to broader audiences? Like, how do we make this something that happens more in schools? How do we make this something that people don't see as useless? How is it that we encourage philosophical study of religion to be important for just being a reflective, socially engaged, moral human? How do we make those things happen? Christy, I want to start with you. You get to wear the crown. What is it you do to bring this, out, to make it bigger?
Well, there's the question, Aaron. If we only knew how to make everyone understand how fundamental these disciplines are to everyday life, right? I would say there are a few things that came to mind. I think that first, and so I'm going to use some of what I said about interfaith dialogue just as an entry and kind of move backwards. I think we need to find a way to destigmatize what religion means in the public space. And I think there are we talked about some tools that some of these other folks have discussed, for the last 50 years about well, 300 really, but what it really means, how do we navigate what it means to have public reason? How do we understand pluralism? How do we understand what we're bringing to the table in this effort to have, the Rawlsian overlapping consensus that this doesn't mean secularism, and I think part of the tension, part of the kind of cultural divide is that we're still kind of wrestling with the idea that religion, qua priority, does need to be left behind private doors. And we've seen in so many different ways why that is fundamentally inadequate. So I think that we need to have a lot more understanding about what it means for our public space to be a pluralistic space, and to have some basic understanding of civil discourse and public reason. But beyond that, the questions that most motivate me and what have, engaged me for all this time is really trying to challenge what we understand by some of these really rigid lines. I mean, I've always been one who enjoys, why I'm kind of a borderline, philosopher and scholar of religious studies is that I really enjoy reading things against the grain. I really enjoy thinking of how it is that, problems that exist within heterodoxy and problems that exist within how we've put all of these things in all of these, qualities and categories in areas that don't really work anymore. So I think we need to think a little bit more along the same lines of what pluralism means, by also what it means to have different types, kind of a multiplicity of religious orientations, religious identity that isn't necessarily in conflict with one another. And that's how we need to become more empathetic, and we need to learn a little bit more from each other. So a lot of it really has to do with the dialogue that we can have in forums like this, I think.
Yeah. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Let's go to Carnahan. How would you add? So Christy's basic point is, let's stop being assholes.
Yeah.
So what would you
exactly
add
what I said.
to that claim?
Yeah, so I'm pessimistic in general. So the things that I do, so as you've mentioned, I have like a TikTok channel. I engage with people in their videos. I do responses to people across a wide range of things, but it includes philosophy of religion things. It includes Christian theology. It includes ethics. And I just got to say, I mean, a lot of that breaks down into, especially in the philosophy of religion area, kind of first year freshman, apologetics arguments about, Islam is the correct religion or Christianity is the correct religion or things like that. And in part, I'm trying to get people past just that view, right? And I keep trying to suggest, it might be that there are rational versions of multiple different religions, right? Not that all versions of religions are rational, but it's entirely possible that, and it might be that I'm justified in following one and you're justified in following another, and moving people beyond what I think is a very kind of strong rationalist, foundationalist epistemology, where they think that, oh no, there's only, at the end of the day, one of these is going to be rational. I'm going to make sure that I'm on that one, and I'm going to be able to defeat everybody else that's out there in whatever, game that we're playing. And in part that just means like a lot of what I do is just being critical of a whole bunch of different positions, Christian positions, Muslim positions, new atheist positions that I'm just, trying to engage with. And I think that there is at least a group of people for whom that's really refreshing, to be able to be like, oh my gosh, he isn't just coming out and saying, oh, this is the right way. It's obviously the right way. If you disagree with me, you're irrational. But I've got to say, it's hard going. And there are a lot of people that are just not open to that at all. And especially in our current kind of political age and everything else, I think it's extremely hard to fight against those tendencies in our society.
Yeah. So Christy's suggesting that we not be assholes. Kevin is suggesting that vanilla is boring. Yeah, so it sounds right to me. So Shilbrack, what would you add to this high level discussion here?
I'm pessimistic too about the state of things these days. But you said we get to be what, Secretary of Education or something like that?
You have all the power. That's right.
My dad used to say, when I'm dictator, I'm going to fix this. Um, um, I don't hate that idea that my class said, can you give us religious philosophy that'll help us live our lives? That kind of spiritual turn, or whatever you want to call it, in philosophy of religion. I don't hate that. It reminds me a little bit, to go back to that event that I mentioned an hour ago about being on stage with Bruce Lincoln. And I can remember, and I was a junior faculty member, I wasn't really prepared to cross swords, but he was like, but we're not supposed to tell students how to live. And he wanted the normative out of religious studies. He wanted what he considered theology out of religious studies. And here I was defending what I considered to be a normative project. But for me, the normative project is this question of, look, people are already living their lives, and they're on these paths, and they're oriented in these different ways, and they have reflected on them. And so, like Kevin was saying, they've got rational versions of it. Well, let's take a look and listen to them. And I want you to be asking and answering a normative question. But I'm not teaching my view any more than when I taught, the ethics of abortion. I wasn't telling students what the right answer was, but I'm scared about this idea that higher education is going to unplug from those questions and say, those are all just opinions. There's no right answer. And so philosophy has nothing to contribute. And therefore, we're only going to, this is the governor of Florida a few years ago, we're only going to give loans to go to universities if you are in a vocational track, not if you're doing something. I think his example was art history, not if you're doing something that's not a job. And this is so widespread. I had a colleague one time who was a historian, so comparable, I guess, in some ways to Bruce Lincoln. And this historian said, Kevin, I know that you, as a philosopher, you want to do the normative stuff, but I don't do it. I'm a social scientist, and you do values, I do facts, But here I was the department chair, right? So I sit in the back of that person's class, and I'm watching them teach. And they put up on the PowerPoint a picture of the Pope and the evil emperor from Star Wars, and said, can anyone find a single difference? And so which of us is being normative in the classroom? I'm teaching questions, but I'm not telling them the answers. I'm telling them, you have to sort this out. The abortion question in the ethics class, or the Buddhist philosophy question in the philosophy of religion class, or the Stoic spirituality. I'm not telling them what's right, but that person was, you know what I mean? That person does have a normative agenda that they're offering in the first person, whereas the so-called normative disciplines like academic theology, like ethics, like philosophy of religion, we're taking a step back and saying, you have to answer these questions, and you are answering these questions, but I want you to do it reflectively and in conversation with people of multiple perspectives and so forth. So,
But that's so true. I mean, if I could just add to that, I mean, that's why I'm maybe a tiny bit more optimistic, because
Please.
In all of these, in the uproar in which I find myself on a daily basis, it's coming from the top down. It's coming from what I argued before was a real misunderstanding about what we teach, how we teach, the questions that we ask, and the expectations that we have. It's not coming, knock on wood, from the students. And there's been so much effort to solicit opinions and come from the woodwork, come from the hills, about all you students that are not allowed to speak your mind, or all you students that are being indoctrinated. And it's happened over and over again that nobody is saying anything, because students do not feel that way. And I think a lot of us are very nervous because of the disciplines that we teach, not because there's any kind of normative expectation, but just because there's a real fundamental understanding about what we do in these classes. But I really do feel that the experience from the students and what they're hungry for and what they're interested in learning and how they navigate these differences.
Yeah.
Is so, it really has been a positive experience. And I can say that, teaching a number of classes that will fall on the hit list whenever there is one. So there's hope. There's reason for hope. There you go. And we shouldn't be assholes, but there you go.
It's always a good recommendation. Shilbrack, Sanders is asking a question that I would love to get your take on before I answer the question I asked you all. So can we think of spirituality as a kind of like, look, this is a way of inviting students to think about what they find helpful for a living, right? Like this is actually one of the greatest resources to empower students, not simply to be shills of whatever, they've been taught or they've been told. We are actively the counterweight against the indoctrination from broader political forces claiming that we're indoctrinating a student. So what do you think about this kind of pragmatic approach to spirituality? Is that a way to understand what you're suggesting?
Yeah, Sanders' question is a great question. And I don't hate the idea that everything they do at the university is going to be pragmatic, that they're sorting out how much do I need to know about nutrition? How much exercise do I need to do? Do I need to know about music? What about religious studies? What about philosophy? And not just the vocational, narrow understanding of what school's about. I have a love-hate relationship with pragmatism. And so I guess I want to say yes or yes, but because I think I haven't said this out loud before, but I tend to think of Southeast Asia had these debates going on between Hindus and Buddhists and Jains. East Asia had these debates going on between Confucians and Taoists and now Chinese Buddhists, and Western Asia had Judaism and Christianity and Islam. In all these cases, it was not merely a pragmatic thing. They weren't saying, well, what feels best for you and what do you think works, right? They went metaphysical and they would say, but there is a reason why this is true. And I want to give you an argument, and just to take the South Asian example as one of, but we could do all three. Why consciousness is the way we're describing consciousness. The self is the way we're describing the self. Your experiences when you meditate, they come out this way for this reason. And so I do like Sanders' question about teaching spirituality as not as a single approach is correct, but as pragmatic. But I would want to take them, as Kevin said earlier, like in their reflective sense and in their textual sense, because they've had representative intellectuals thinking about those traditions and defending those traditions, and I want to include that and not just William Jamesy version of pragmatism.
Right. Well, and I know that Carnahan, who I can't tell you how many conversations we have had where the deep substantive reply to my, heartfelt, agonizing concern was, well, look, you just be a pragmatist. It all goes away.
Yeah. So, does it work? I don't understand.
Yeah.
Why are you?
Why do you keep arguing about squirrels, man? Yeah. So if I may, I'm going to give the answer that I think I would offer to this final question, and then we're going to move into our fun speed round and call it a night. So one of the things that I realized probably a decade ago, and it was in some ways a big surprise to me because I had been trained in, grad school basically at the same place that Christy was trained. We both studied together at Florida State. The idea was, yes, we should ask these deep questions, but in some ways it was kind of, but don't let them implicate you too much, right? Be these scholars that can take up these concerns, model for students what it looks like to be this kind of powerhouse intellect that can stay at an arm's distance. And then what, though, was so fascinating to me is, though that was what we were getting over and over and over, there were also the few professors who it wasn't that for them. It was, I'm asking this question and writing these books and wrestling with this because this is what keeps me up at night, because I've got to figure out where I stand in this debate. Otherwise, I don't know how I'm doing anything different than just being a auto mechanic of ideas, right? fix this thing, put that solenoid. Oh, look, here it goes. But is this a car worth driving? Right. And one of the thinkers who I've talked about in my own work, who influenced me very deeply on this, was a professor that Christy and I both had named David Kangas. And he modeled in his living what it looked like to let these questions be important. And then when I got to Vanderbilt, I had a professor named David Wood who did the same thing. And so in many ways, what I came to discover as a professor was, unless I'm living a life where these questions are alive, it's really hard to convince my students that they should come alive in response to these questions. Now, what's important here, this does not mean expecting or encouraging students to agree with me about where I then find myself living. And in some ways, I actively discourage. I'm like, guys, look, I think that P, but it turns out smarter people than me think I'm wrong. So here's why I've got real hesitancy about my own view on this topic, right? And for what it's worth, all of you have guest lectured in my classes, and we've disagreed in front of my students. And I think that there's something powerful also when we talk about, the worries about deliberative democracy and the threats to democracy we currently face. Wow, what could be more preparatory for entering civil spaces than being good at understanding the reasons other people stand elsewhere, right? And so for me, what I've tried to do is not let philosophy be confessional. Again, I'm opposed to confessional philosophy, not because I think that it's bad. I just think that it's not the best strategy for getting people excited about this. I'm a fan of what I call personal philosophy. Let this stuff come alive. And so I've been plugging all of y'all's work all night long. I will plug one of my books. It just came out about a year ago, Camping with Kierkegaard. The whole point of writing that book was an attempt to invite people to walk with me into the questions that accompany me wherever I go on the trails of life, while mountain biking, trout fishing, whatever it is I'm doing. And I have found the students, in some ways, Shilbrack, to your point, like they are eager for someone to say, I'm not here to tell you what you should love, but damn if I'm not going to invite you to become a good lover, right? Like we will do this well. And to Christy's point, it's not something that then I have, the students getting angry because, oh, you're indoctrinating us. Mm-hmm. In many cases, they get frustrated because, but how could you possibly, personally, I identify as a Christian. It's like, how could you be a Christian? You also think all these other things that my pastor said are bad, right? Mm-hmm. Now we're doing real complicated, self-challenging sort of work. And it's not because I want them to know where I stand because they should agree. It's I want them to know where I stand so they can take seriously what it looks like to stand somewhere and be really good at understanding why people stand elsewhere, right? So Camping with Kierkegaard was my attempt to do that sort of work. I hope folks will pick up a copy, now available in Audible. But what I also would say is I would encourage philosophers. So we've talked about like what we would do in the classroom, how we would approach this, but I would also encourage my philosophical peers to recognize that we've got to become good, like all of you are, at translating these academic narrow debates in ways that people can see the stakes of. Right. And so, Kevin, you talked about doing this on TikTok. I do this weekly on Substack and try really hard to say, well, what would it look like to think about popular music, to think about ideas that confront us while at Walmart or going to get a cup of tea? How is it we could think together more effectively about the stuff we encounter every single day so that philosophy isn't something we wish we had done back in college, right? Or something that we are actively avoiding in order to be practical and go into vocational training. Philosophy is something that we need at all stages of our life. not so that some person from on top of the mountain tells us what to do or how to live, but because it allows us to remind ourselves that the questions we ask are worth asking. And if they're not worth asking, walk with better people who say, that's kind of a dumb question. Like Carnahan tells me all the time, right? So I think we've got to be more personally available and model what we hope they will find interesting. And then secondly, we've got to be more willing to be advocates for philosophy, critical thinking as a way of being better at whatever we do, rather than thinking, oh, what can I do with that? Yeah. Right? Which is Kevin Shilbrack, what all my students and usually their parents are asking, what can they do with this? My response is not be an asshole, be more interesting, live a life where grief and despair are going to inevitably accompany us, but not be overwhelmed by it. Find a way to be successful without being defined by your accomplishments. Find a way to navigate failure without being wrecked by it, right? Like in general, what we do in these spaces is invite people to be better at living the life they will have lived. And it's like a buddy of mine yesterday, I'll finish with this because this is such a freaking great story. I was yesterday mountain biking up at a bike park near where I live, outside of Asheville, North Carolina. And I'm sitting there talking to a couple of friends of mine. And one of them says, dude, like, do you even think college is like worthwhile anymore? Is there any point? And so I was like, well, it turns out, yeah, but not because here's the lifetime earning statistics, which I can give you, not because it opens up these sorts of doors, which it does, but because it's where you get 4 years to tarry with the question, what's worth my finitude, which is the question of Camping with Kierkegaard. What's worthy of my life? Am I okay with who I'm becoming, right? So I'm saying all this. And this dude, like 2 cars away, just yells out. He's like, hell yeah. And so we all, of course, look over and we're sitting there in like body armor and full face helmets, you know, and he looks at us, he's like, dude, philosophy, right? And I was like, yeah, I'm a professor of philosophy. And this guy looks at me, he says, I've got a philosophy. And of course, now, you know, all my antennae are just blaring like, oh, you do you? Oh, and he says, yep, value will always lead to growth. And I thought, well, shoot, I was like ready to be skeptical. Like, dude, that's really smart. And he's like, yeah, man, what you value, what you think's worthwhile, that's where you're going to invest yourself. That's where you're going to grow. Value leads to growth, man. And so I, of course, Carnahan said, that sounds a lot like Augustine, and then made it entirely less cool. And then as he's putting on his knee pads and getting his bike off his truck, he goes, hell yeah. He said, you know where I came up with that? And of course, I now was like thinking this dude's really reflective and smart. He goes, I was strung out on meth when that hit me, and I've never let go of it. And to his credit, the guy's name was Alan Hayes. Alan, if for any reason you ever watch this, I told you I would shout you out. I was absolutely blown away because what he actually was saying is everything that matters. Our lives can go to absolute chaos. But in those moments, what grounds you, right? What will still be true? Where will you find yourself? And then we were riding the shuttle up to the drop-in, and one of the guys I was with, he says, you know, he's like, that guy, that sounded smart. And he said, part of why I mountain bike is because this is what keeps me sober. Like our event, our day was transformed in deep personal ways because that dude overheard us having a conversation that wasn't just dumb, right? And it led to a real reflection on stuff that matters. And that's ultimately what Campfire Philosophy is meant to be, is sitting around a campfire with smart people talking about stuff that matters and inviting everybody else to think with us along the way, right? So I can't tell you guys how much I appreciate you being with me to do this. For everybody else, make sure you get a copy of Camping with Kierkegaard. I'll stick it up again. I would love to keep thinking with you by going over to my Substack, Philosophy in the Wild. I will continue to post twice a week there, and we can think together. So before we call it a night, I'm going to be asking every week the following 5 questions to all of my guests, everybody at the campfire. And believe me, this is where everything comes flying straight off the cliff of substance to ridiculousness.
Oh, gosh.
All right. So first, beach or mountains, Shilbrack?
Mountains.
Christy?
Beach.
Oh, wrong answer. Oh,
mountains. I can't stand the sand. No.
Oh, can't stand the sand. A shirt will be coming your way that says that. And for what it's worth, Christy is a friend of my wife, Vanessa. Vanessa thinks beach all day long, and the mountains are things to cross over on the way to the beach. So,
Agreed.
Number 2, hot chocolate, hot tea, or coffee? Christy.
Coffee.
Carnahan.
Hot chocolate.
Shilbrack.
Coffee all day.
Oh my gosh. All right. See, Carnahan, this is scaring me because you and I should not be in this much agreement.
No.
The other version of that question is tell me which is better, hot chocolate, hot tea, or coffee, and then explain why it's hot chocolate. So number 3, your favorite campfire food other than s'mores, Carnahan.
Hot dogs. It's got to be hot dogs.
All right, Shilbrack.
Is there a good campfire food?
Like healthy?
Yes.
No.
Anything cooked over the fire, man, it wins.
Does it have to be cooked over the fire? Or is it
It's
just
something-
consumed at the campfire?
Consumed at the campfire is fine. We'll allow that.
You know what would be nice? You wake up, it's cold, you go up and then you start the fire and you make breakfast. And so you've got like eggs and coffee and
Okay.
you have to wrap the blanket around yourself.
Love it. See, that's a brilliant answer. What do you think, Christy? What do you take into the campfire?
Wine.
Now I understand why she said, does it have to be cooked on the fire?
Yeah. That's right.
Not mulled wine. Just,
Yeah.
Your mulled wine, bring some spices.
No.
Yeah.
no.
That's hilarious. I love it. All right. This is a question because increasingly I am finding people who think the answer to this is yes. And I think that they are clearly living in a different reality than me. Music by a campfire, yes or no? What do you think, Carnahan?
Yes.
Oh, Shilbrack, music
I'm
by the
okay
campfire?
with no music.
Okay. Christy?
Yes.
As long as it's Jimmy Buffett.
Didn't you go to church camp at some point? Like,
Yeah, man. But look, so I'm fine with, like I have a buddy, Waylon, who thinks that whenever we go to the woods, he should break out his guitar. I'm actually cool with that, right?
Yeah, that would be good.
I'm fine with that. I'm less a fan of when I go like to campgrounds and, 2 campsites over has decided that Leonard Skinner needs to be played at 11. So I guess there's a kind of level of nuance here.
So not other people's music around the fire, but
Our
your
music.
own.
sure.
Our
okay with
Jimmy
that.
Buffett album by the campfire.
Christy, for what it's worth, my wife's dad just turned 80 a couple weeks ago.
saw
And so
that.
she was down in Florida. Yeah. And he's a big Buffett fan. So big signs, pirate turns 80. Yeah.
Love
I
it.
thought of you.
Love it.
All right. Last question. You could take one philosopher camping with you, alive or dead. Who would it be, Shilbrack?
Now, come to me last. I got to think about it.
All right, we'll come back. Carnahan, one philosopher, alive or dead. Who do you go
I
camping
mean,
with?
I suppose the answer's got to be Socrates, right? He could at least keep a conversation going. That's gotta be.
He also would have loved the wine answer.
Yeah, that's true.
Since in vino veritas, right?
Yeah.
He certainly got silly while drinking wine in the evenings with folks. What do you think, Christy?
Nietzsche.
Ooh,
Damn.
ooh, wow! That's a heavy campfire.
I don't know what's going
My
to happen,
gosh.
but
That's
that's
gonna be
what's
intense.
coming.
Yeah, the
He-
mix of
you know, I
Nietzsche and wine.
Well, he had that claim that he was
Sorry,
dynamite, right?
Dionysian.
So, yeah, you may want to keep him away from the fire. I don't know. All right, Shilbrack, who do you take with you?
Give me a Whitehead.
Oh,
Oh,
oh my goodness.
you want to
must
study
be
the
talking about
progress
art.
of the fire? Is that
Say that what?
the progress of the fire as you go?
The actual entity of each burning ember. Well, I should note, as I do in Camping with Kierkegaard, I would never want actually to go camping with Kierkegaard. That guy, I am sure, would be an absolute Debbie Downer, and it would be a horrible, horrible night. But I'm going to give different answers to this every week. I actually tonight think it would be super cool to have Simone de Beauvoir by the campfire, because I think she was a better philosopher than Sartre and never got the credit that she really deserved. And I would love to think with her about how ambiguity plays out. And I think what better place to talk about ambiguity than while drinking hot chocolate, eating a hot dog by the campfire. I'd take, or wine. I'd take Simone de Beauvoir. So, well, y'all, this has been fantastic. Thanks again to Kevin Schilbrack. Make sure you go get a copy of his book, Philosophy and the Study of Religions. It is wonderful. I teach it in almost every class I do concerning philosophy of religion. It is absolutely fantastic. A wonderful, wonderful book. It's also accessible, which is rare. Make sure that you follow Kevin Carnahan on TikTok for no other reason than it will make you laugh, because he does unbelievably complicated things in very short little ways. It reminds me of that wonderful comment by Sarah Vowell, where she said she was having a bumper sticker made that says "Carry on complicated conversations with bumper stickers." So if you want to see what that looks like, follow Carnahan on TikTok. A huge thank to Christy, and you can also learn more about the Interfaith Dialogue program at UCF. They've got all kinds of events going on down there, so make sure you reach out to them so that you can come to any event if you live in Central Florida. And finally, a huge, huge thanks to Siip for all of their support. Make sure that you go on over to planksiip.org. And if you use the code Aaron, it will get you a 50% membership discount for their ideal membership. Again, they do free book publishing. They will work with you and their editors to get your ideas out to a broad audience. It's really an amazing philosophical community doing all the kinds of public work that we are celebrating here. So go over to planksiip.org. Big thanks to Daniel and the whole team over there. And then finally, please do come connect with me over at Philosophy in the Wild. I would love to think with you on a regular basis. I do all kinds of stuff there. We do live Zooms with paid subscribers. There's 2 posts a week, free and paid options available. And don't forget to grab a copy of Camping with Kierkegaard while you're at it. So this brings to a close our first episode of Campfire Philosophy. We will be doing this each Monday night through July and August. So for everybody, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on all the platforms that it's currently streaming on. It will also be uploaded as an audio podcast to Spotify, Apple Music, and other places about 2 or 3 days after the live streams air. So I hope to see you all next week, where I will be joined by 3 amazing scholars to talk about AI and human flourishing. And in particular, we're going to think about the ways that philosophy and the humanities can be a resource for doing AI even more effectively. So next week, we'll be joined by the author of AI in 5 Minutes. We'll also be talking to someone doing AI in the context of religious studies, and also a retired NASA engineer who was one of the early funders of the work going on in the 70s and 80s that became what we now know as generative AI. So next week, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Monday night, AI and human flourishing here on Campfire Philosophy. So again, thanks to all of my guests. You all rock my face. You are amazing. And to everybody else, I hope to see you next week.
On the trail, for hiking with me a few miles more, for casting out your line into waters in which we both stand, for dropping in at the top and fist bumping me at the bottom, and for coming camping with me and Kierkegaard. Our time together has been so very worthy of my finitude. I hope it was worthy of yours as well.